is Lauri, Joanna, and Amanda, who reached out to me and said, we think this information would be helpful to the community. And I reached out to a couple people and we decided, yes, we were going to make this happen. And boom, it is not even a week later and we've got it going. I'm so excited. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauri, Joanna, and Amanda.
And Sherry, I wanted to thank you for that, especially for those of us who won't be able to get into the room because of capacity.
Right.
The fact that your organization is making this recording free and available to everyone is a huge, huge boon to education right now. It's just a tremendously important time, and your generosity is incredible with doing that. So thank you. And thank you everyone for being here with us today. I'm Joanna Beth Tweedy, and with me are Lauri Barnes and Amanda Temkiewicz. We're your presenters for today. Lauri is at the University of St. Augustine, and Amanda and I are at Western Governors University, which we affectionately refer to as WGU. And among us, Lauri, Amanda, and I spent many years teaching in on-ground settings from the kindergarten through high school and university levels. But for the past several years, we have worked and taught in completely online environments. What we wanted to do today is share with you some of the tools and strategy that have been helpful to us in online instruction. So many of our colleagues here today have been recently and abruptly moved online out of the need to offer continuing learning opportunities to students. And these are students who have been displaced from their classrooms during a truly crucial time in our world. And we know this is not easy for those students, and we want you to know that we know it's not easy for their teachers either. You too have been displaced from your classrooms. And in the current context of destabilization and classroom displacement, that continuity of learning support, it becomes paramount for reasons that go well beyond the acquisition of knowledge. Education has always been a source of discovery, but not only discovery, security for our students. And it doesn't matter if you're teaching students in kindergarten or at the PhD level. That element of discovery coupled with security is so important. And so as you all move your classes online, the instructional tools you'll be using, they're also going to become the essential components of cohesion in your students' lives. And in that, you are a tacit yet immense force of stabilization amid disorder. And we hear it over and again that healthcare workers are on the front lines of this current battle, and they certainly are. But educators are holding the entire fortress in place, keeping it from crumbling amid the fallout from that battlefield. So just know, I'm going to get choked up. What you do is so important. And as you undertake this endeavor, we really wanted to do whatever we could to make the online world feel like a more inviting instructional home for you these next several weeks. And that's what this webinar is all about. It is a webinar for teachers by teachers, and it's designed to support your transition to online instruction. It is purposefully not intended to be exhaustive by any stretch. We didn't want to overwhelm anyone. It's an introduction to some of the things we use every day to reach and teach our students. And just please know, caveat, we have no monetary or nepotistic ties to any of the tools we're going to talk about, nothing like that. We have no skin in that game. The skin we have in this game is ensuring that the future is filled with leaders who can make our world a place where everyone has a chance to not only survive regional and global crises, but thrive beyond them. And we all know that the way to do that is through education. So thank you again for what you do. For those who are here today from K-12 settings and are interested in using this learning experience for professional development, continuing education credits, we will be collecting name, email, and school district information at the end. So we have a feedback survey at the end for everyone to fill out because we do want your feedback. We'd like to know what else you may find helpful on this topic. But also on the survey, there will be a place for those who will be attempting CEU credits to fill in additional contact information, which is completely optional. But if you're interested in follow-up information about additional webinars from this session, you can fill out that optional contact information on the survey at the end as well. We do have another webinar on Friday, and that webinar will be facilitated in large part by Amanda, who is one of the faculty managers in the WG Writing Center. She will be speaking to the experience of facilitating online teams in case that has particular interest and relevance to any of our audience members here today. Right now during this webinar, Amanda will be focusing much of her time in the chat to address questions that come up there. So we highly encourage you to ask those questions and have that dialogue among yourselves. The chat is a very rich place for that in these sessions. And we do appreciate everyone muting yourselves, so we cut down on that ambient background noise that can be distracting for others. And in terms of kind of those little housekeeping things, I'm going to turn it over to Lauri right now, who's going to talk about some of the Zoom Room features.
Well, welcome to the internet. You are now in the kind of space that we use when we work with our students. Zoom Room is a great way to work one-on-one with a student, or you can work in groups. Now, for the free version of Zoom, I just wanted to put this out there. If you're working with more than one person, the time limit is 40 minutes. But if you're just one-on-one, just two people in the room, there is no limit on time. Now, a larger room like this is set up, I think this is more of a pay version where you're allowed to have up to a certain number of participants, like 100 in this room. But I wanted to point out a few of the features that we can use during today's webinar. If you will use your mouse and mouse over the bottom of the screen where you see all of our faces and all the things we're sharing on the screen, a little toolbar will appear, and you'll notice that there are some things such as a reaction button, and then there's also a button to get to the chat. So if you don't have the chat visible, click on that chat button and it should populate over to the right side of your screen. And then what I'd like everyone to do is to use your react button and choose a thumbs up if you can see your chat. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Excellent. Perfect. So in the chat, you'll also notice that there is an option. Whoops, I went too far. There's an option over that you can mouse over in the chat area where you can choose a yes or no reaction to answer questions. Can everyone find that feature within the chat?
Okay. No, and it sounds like some people in the chat are chiming in and saying they do have it or they don't have it. So
okay, it could be like a different version that was downloaded. That could possibly be the case. Let's go on and move on to the next feature. Or Joanna, Beth was going to talk to you a little bit about the continuity needs and the importance of staying in touch during this time with your students.
And the basic continuity needs in the immediate term really have to do with student support, that continued instruction and learning, because all of this is going on, but assignments are still due. And even though it feels like much of our lives has come to a halt, the clock still ticks, the tests still have to be taken, the papers still need to be written. But these continuity needs also have to do with faculty and staff support needs. And at its most basic, the income for hourly workers in your schools and your departments and your divisions. And Lauri's going to talk more about some software to track those sorts of things later, some scheduling software. But there are some fundamental affective needs that we as human beings have. These are really trying times. The crisis is going to touch all of us very personally in some way, shape, or form. And we've been separated from one another. And technology is criticized for doing that in our world. We have to recognize that our students have been separated from their classroom environments, that safe zone, which for some is a significant source of structure, consistency, and comfort in their lives. And as teachers, you are the fosterers of those spaces where discovery and security exist together, which, for students who don't have these characteristics in their home environments, that's everything to them. And in a best case scenario, all of us would just have these continued community building opportunities in place, ways we could gather online, synchronously at a distance, all at once, in the perfect little groups that we need. Because human beings are hardwired to connect. And if you think back over your lives, probably some of the most important connection points in your lives revolve around your experiences in a school or a workplace community, because we need these touch points. So with everything all of us are experiencing right now, it's really very possible that your students need you as that substantive touch point in their lives more than ever before. So it's our hope that the tools we show you can be used in instruction, but also that they can be leveraged to serve as some of these touch points for cohesiveness among your colleagues and students and the groups that you turn to for support. And if they can be those touch points for cohesiveness, let them be. That they are not just instructional tools. Technology can be a gift in that way too. I mentioned that it's criticized, but it can also build those communities. Next is a list of several of the tools we're going to be talking about today. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts. This list is categorized, and we've made notes about the use of these tools and where you can find them if you want to try them out on your own. Lauri's going to talk more about the categories later, but what we want you to know about this list right now are two things. First, you will have a copy of this list. This is one of the resources from this session. You'll have a copy of these slides and everything. Second, the types of tools we're going to focus on in this webinar are two kinds. We're going to focus on feedback tools and scheduling tools. Those are the two types of tools we're going to talk about. Many of the feedback tool examples you'll see are focused on writing feedback simply because we happen to be writing instructors. However, these tools can be used for any type of feedback, from math to science to speech communication to art classes. So we encourage you to think about how you might use the examples in the particular content area you teach, because we recognize that not everyone watching this webinar is a writing instructor. So as you see the examples that we use, which are going to be writing focused, and you have an idea for your particular content area, please share those ideas with us in the chat, and especially with one another. I saw some really cool things going on in the chat when everyone didn't have the reaction buttons in their particular browser or version, or maybe you're on your mobile phone or what have you, and people were helping each other out. And this is going to happen among your students and your colleagues as well. And I think it's a really another wonderful way to build community too. And we would love to hear your ideas too. And it's going to be helpful for your colleagues in the room. And I just want to mention too, if you ask a bunch of writing professors like us, we're going to tell you that any class that requires a written form of communication is a writing class. So all of you are writing teachers anyway, no matter what you teach. And the next two slides are going to cover some guiding principles in online instruction, and Lauri's going to talk about those.
Thank you, Joanna, Beth. So the Conference for College Composition and Communication put out a position statement on online instruction, and I think we can pull some principles from that apply not only to teaching writing online, but would apply to any kind of online teaching environment. So we're not going to go over all of them, just a few key ones that I think would apply to everyone. First of all, you want to make sure that your online instruction is universally accessible for your students. So think about things like when you make a video, making sure you have captioning. And some of the things you may not think about, there are some checklists that can help you think about accessibility. So in that resource that Joanna Beth showed on the previous slide that had those tools, we do have some tools about accessibility that may be helpful to you for ensuring that your coursework and all your assignments and everything you do is accessible to students of all needs and all learning abilities. And one thing I found in working with making things universally accessible, when you're thinking about things like those who might be hearing impaired or may have visual needs, that when you meet those needs, you're also meeting the needs of people who learn in different ways. It's a way of differentiating your instruction. So you're not only helping those that you may think of as special needs students, but as all students have different ways of learning, the more you're universally accessible, the more you're reaching all kinds of learners. The second principle is that you want to focus on the content. Although we're working in technology, sometimes we get so excited about a new kind of technology that the focus becomes the technology itself and not on the content. So, for example, you wouldn't want to, with a student, throw an assignment that you're going to create a website, because then that student needs to learn how to do HTML. So yes, they're in the online environment, but those are some things that would be quite unfamiliar and would distract from the focus, which is your content area. So So in writing, we want to focus on getting them writing as much as possible. And even when we have these contact times where we have this live instruction, think about shorter times of instruction and longer times of engagement with the work. So sometimes you can think of a flipped classroom approach. So perhaps if you're going to be engaging with students synchronously, perhaps you can send something ahead of time that you can bring together and discuss as a group in an online environment. So focus on the writing itself, not on the technology, and not on recording long lectures to fill the time. That's really not going to be as beneficial. Get them engaged in their work. The third principle I wanted to talk about was making the most of the features of the online environment. So you are online, well, do make use of those features. Don't ignore that you are in that special setting. So if you are using something like we are here, we have the chat where we can use these to ask questions. So I want to pose a question to the participants today. So how can technology help with different stages in the writing process? If you're a writing teacher, how can you think of using technology to help with maybe the planning stage or the editing stage? What's unique about a technology or online setting that you can really leverage for teaching different stages of the writing process? And Amanda, I'm gonna let you read some of those off as they're coming in.
You can see history of student work. That's
Absolutely.
a great point. Yeah.
Sometimes you can ask them to turn on their track changes on their document, and you can see, you get a little insight into what they're thinking of as they're planning or the reorganizing of their work.
In Google Docs with the revision history was just mentioned, you can also give feedback on students' feedback practices. Oh, and this is a good one. Some platforms allow for collaborative writing, which is a unique feature. Your comments are automatically saved. These are great ones.
And we're going to talk about some other things that we can leverage in technology to make using the writing process or even other content areas much easier to engage with your students. So thank you for sharing those.
I think
So
there's a really important point too, someone just made, that some students are reluctant to speak up right away. And so this environment can encourage them to be more generative and collaborative. And I think that's very true.
And what's interesting is right now you were writing, you're typing in the text in that chat box. And so some students who might be less likely to do so are more likely in the online environment. They get into this mindset, especially the K through 12 group, where they enjoy doing YouTubing and they do chat and games. And so engaging in a chat, they might actually begin to write full sentences where they might be reluctant to do so in another environment. So you're actually, by using your chat actively, you're engaging your students in writing, which is a fantastic thing. So I wanted to also point out principle 4, which is that everything you learned in your teaching theory doesn't go out the window because you're online. So good teaching is still good teaching, whether it's online or whether it's in person. So use those same kinds of strategies that you know to be true and you know to work, and we just want to translate them into the online environment. So if you know that you don't want to mark every single error on a paper when you return it to a student, and when you do it in handwriting, of course you're not going to do that. You're not going to overmark a paper in the online environment. So those same principles that you know to be true, keep those in mind when you're working in the online environment. Just because it's easier to do in online, make sure you're not doing it in a way that isn't pedagogically sound. And the last thing I wanted to mention to you, the last principle would be that you want to make sure when you're working with a team and other online teachers that you realize people work in different ways. So what someone's doing to present the content may be different than the way you're presenting the content, and that's okay. We don't have to imitate what someone else is doing because we need to be comfortable with the way that we're teaching. I don't know if you've ever been in the situation where someone has passed you lecture notes and asked you to teach them, but sometimes that's hard to do when it's not something you have personally created. You've got to make it your own so that you feel like you really know what you're doing. So don't feel like because someone else is doing their online instruction in a certain way that you have to do it that way. Do it in a way that feels comfortable and natural for you. Some different ways of using the technology. I'm going to start with some of the lower tech ways of using technology, because it occurred to me we also want to be mindful that not all of our students have the access to technology that all of us may have. Particularly if you're in a K through 12 environment, perhaps some of your students may not have computers at home. We think it's ubiquitous that the computers are everywhere, but be thinking of that. If, reach out to your students and find out if they have the technology, because we can go very low tech to higher levels of technology to engage with them. So if a student doesn't have a computer, you can even have them read their paper to you over the phone. I mean, that's as low tech as you can get if they can't get it to you, to still engage with writing and let that student know that you still care and you're still engaged. You're not going to have many in that boat, but if it happens, it happens. And there's a way around that. Another way we can deal with students and work with papers is students can email you a copy of the paper and then you can speak on the phone. Discussing the copy of the paper so that you're looking at the email copy, the student's looking at a copy on the student's own screen without even using screen sharing. That's very low tech to do. If you're thinking about, I don't want to share my phone number with my students, look into using Google Voice, and you can get a phone number which is a forwarded number. They call that number and it forwards to your phone. So if you know something's coming in on that number, you know it's a business call, it's a school call, and you're not giving out your home number. So keep that in mind if you need to use your phone and you want to protect your own number. Using Google Docs, someone had mentioned in the chat using Google Docs. That's a fantastic way to collaborate. You can share links and you can share the document, and anyone is open to edit that document, and you can make comments in the margin on that document as you're collaborating on that. And so that's a great way for instruction as well. So a shared Google Doc, as well as using phone interaction, or there are even applications for just doing screen share, not doing or doing now where I'm screen sharing and we're on video. This is a more robust kind of software, but there are just downloads for doing screen sharing. And in that case, you can really put the student in the driver's seat, where the student is sharing the student's own screen with you, and the student decides where to go in the paper and what needs to be focused on. And that's a great way to give that student autonomy and give that student a feeling of ownership of that paper, is letting them be the one to do the screen sharing. So those are some of the easier, lesser technology required versions. Using email, using the Google Docs in a phone, or using screen sharing applications. So there were higher tech ways. I'm going to pass on to Joanna Beth.
So there are some more fancy pants options that you have with all kinds of bells and whistles. And Dwayne, I challenge you to use fancy pants in one of your Easter eggs or hidden gems. I like that, the buried treasure. The conversation going on in the chat is just wonderful. So of those fancy pants options, one of those includes video conferencing and what we're doing right here. There are all kinds of different functions in a video conference that can be leveraged. We're keeping it pretty simple in this one. And when you run into problematic situations with those functions, such as everyone doesn't have the reactions or something like that, you just go with the flow. You change it up. So you just type yes in the chat instead of clicking yes. You'll really find that the technology, that point two that Lauri was talking about, focusing on the instruction is the most important thing. Don't let the technology glitches or hiccups get in your way at all. The instruction is the most important thing, and we're teachers. We can make that happen no matter what we're doing. I think it's just sometimes the technology makes it a lot easier, but when it doesn't, just go with it, keep teaching. So aside from video screencasting or video conferencing, there's also screencasting, which we use a lot of. Now, I just mentioned the room you're in now as an example of video conferencing, and there is a free basic version of Zoom. There are many different ways you can use a video conferencing room, but I think the most important decision you're probably going to make, aside from all the functions and things like that, is who is the room's host going to be? And the reason for that is because, you might assume that the host would be the teacher, but Lauri mentioned a really wonderful way to get students involved is to flip that classroom environment. So have them download the video conferencing app and then have them be the host and share their assignment with you in the app. So Lauri's sharing her screen right now. Well, have the students share their screen with you. That keeps them engaged and them involved. They're not just kind of sitting back eating their Cheerios or focusing on that. They're really having to focus on that assignment and the conversation that they're having with you. They can ask questions, explain their thinking, what have you. And the speaking can all happen through the app. And the apps are easily available either on a mobile or a laptop device. Now, you could certainly opt for the more traditional method where, you are the host and the instructor, but flipping the classroom, it is really a fun experience with students. It helps solidify that deep learning aspect with respect to the neuroscience of learning. We've seen that in the literature, so it's a great way to go. The screencasting option involves using a recording tool like Snagit or Screencast-O-Matic that's going to capture a recording of your screen and your voice while demonstrating whatever it is you're demonstrating on the screen. It could be anything. You could have a whiteboard on your screen. You could have a web page on your screen. You could take students on a virtual field trip, whatever you want to do. We've got a 30-second example on the next slide of screencasting used in a really basic way. It's an example of giving comments on a draft of this is a totally sample essay, just a 30-second example of a very basic screencast.
So I've listed some next steps for things to accomplish before our next meeting. But first, I want to point out you have done a marvelous job proofreading for the types of errors that we spoke about when we met last. And I really want to talk to you about which one of these proofreading strategies that we spoke about that you ended up applying, because you just did a spectacular job. What you're going to want to work on are some originality matters having to do with citations and paraphrasing. I've left you some comments related to some specific areas and examples you can look at for that information. You've got some resources here. And then, once you have had a chance to take a look at the comments and the resources, go ahead and get started on your revision. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to meeting with you again.
So I love those examples that Joanna Beth gave there. What I love about the screencasting in particular is it gives that great overview of the paper, where sometimes the student reading through can misunderstand the context of a comment, or they can get lost in the minutia of what you put on the paper and not see the big picture. And so you can end those screencasts very quickly, give a short video giving the big picture and giving the context, which is really helpful. So I want to talk to you all a little bit about the difference between in-person and online feedback on written work. So of course you don't have the actual tactile paper in front of you, and that sometimes feels different if you're used to writing directly on papers. But the same instruction that you use when you're handwriting on a paper, you really can use those same theories and the same type of instruction using a screen. So use what you know to be true. You want to focus on certain types of errors, the pervasive pattern of error, not all the errors that you see on a paper, because that would overwhelm a student. It would be discouraging. And your goal is to help the student to become a stronger, more independent learner. And so you can't spoon feed everything that is wrong in the paper, but you can say, hey, here's a couple of things that you can focus on for now. We'll pick up the other things later, but for now, let's focus on, let's say if they're having trouble with putting a comma before an and joining together two independent clauses. Very common, even on the college level, we see this all the time. So you may say, this is a comma error you can focus on. Here are some resources for practicing that. And for your next paper, I'm going to model here a couple of places how to repair it. I'm going to highlight where you can, in this section, there's an error and you can repair that. And let's see if you can find them next time you turn in a paper. So very focused review. That's exactly the kind of thing you would do in an in-person environment. You do the same thing in the online environment. So choose how much commenting and what you want to focus on, and how little or how much you actually type on the paper. And you also, of course, would train your tutors to use the same approach online as they would in person. So we usually, if you're working in a writing center environment, and I'd be curious to know how many folks are writing center folks here that are with us today. Why don't you write that in the chat?
Yeah, we have a lot from writing centers, though, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Learning center, right? So that's similar. Yeah.
And how about if you're from a different domain? If you're not from a writing center person, I'd love to see that in the chat as well, so we have an idea of some of the other areas that are joining us.
Tutoring and supplemental instruction. Mostly writing centers that I've seen. I did see a learning center. Let me try and scroll back up.
Athletics student services.
Yeah, that's
fantastic. Well, this is great because it tells me that I can tell you a little bit more about training your tutors. You work with your tutors to be sure that they are not taking ownership of that student's paper, that they are asking the kinds of questions that elicit responses from students. You do the same thing in the online environment. So don't be the one typing all the comments, oh, let's fix this because we're right here on the screen. Ask those same kind of questions like, oh, I'm not sure I understand this. Can you explain it to me? And let the student explain it and say, okay, you should type that right now. Let's go ahead and fix that. So use that as a session, a very active session to work on the paper. Posing questions, prompting, making sure it's student-led, and making sure that you're still doing instruction and not editing. So we have to be careful about that with some of the things that we do in the online environment, especially if we're using track changes. The temptation is to just go ahead and start marking things on the paper because we can see it so nicely with track changes in Microsoft Word. But we need to use that rather judiciously and think about how is this instructing and modeling rather than just doing for the student, because you want them to be learning through what you're doing. And speaking of strategies and modeling, that's a great feature of the online environment. There's so much you can do right there with the student to take them to a resource that is needed at right that moment. You can say, hey, I can help you answer that question. Let's go look at something and see how to do that. Using the strategies and modeling is a really key aspect. I wanted to also show you that idea of using a video field trip. So if a student comes up with a question, for example, how do I use APA? I don't know how to cite this secondary source. And first I'll say, well, don't cite a secondary source, go to a primary one. But if you have to, because perhaps it's in a foreign language and you can't go to the primary one, how would you cite that? Well, I say, let me take you to a resource where you can find the answer. Obviously, I could type in the answer right then on the paper for the student. But how much better is it to take the student to the resource that the student then can use in the future to become an independent learner? So I wanted to demonstrate that for you here in this little video. If I were working with a student on a paper and a sudden question arose, perhaps about APA format, it's a great time to take that student on a little field trip to demonstrate where to access the resources needed. So right now in Microsoft Word, it's very easy when you're sharing your screen to go down to your taskbar, find the icon you need for the internet. In this case, I use Google Chrome. And we can open this up, open up a new tab, go to your bookmarks, and find the resource that you want to use with the students. And if the screen that you are sharing on the web is too small, you can use the three-dot menu on the right, and you can zoom in or zoom out. You can see I've already zoomed in here. We're at 175%. If that's too big, you can certainly make it smaller as well. So there are different ways you can also communicate with commenting on the screen. So whatever your style is, use your style. You don't have to do what someone else is doing. Do what work feels natural for you. So when you write on a paper, do you write above their sentences within the body of the work? Well, perhaps you want to do inline commenting if that's what you like to do. Or are you someone who likes to cross things out and use editing marks? Well, you can use some track changes, but again, use those judiciously. And I'll show you an example in just a moment of how that might be used. You might also be someone who likes to write comments in the margin. Hey, guess what? You can do that in Microsoft Word. There's an insert comment feature where you can very easily add comments in the margin. Or perhaps you're someone who just likes to keep your writing off of the student's work and write your comments at the end. You can still type those in at the end of their paper. So these are still options for you. And also, rubrics are a fantastic tool for giving feedback, and don't neglect those. If you haven't used them in your in-person classroom, I strongly recommend them, even if you're in a brick and mortar. But they're really fabulous in an online environment too, because you can have some set standards that you've communicated to the student before the assignment is due, and then the student can use that as a checklist to see if they've met those requirements. And then you give feedback on that same rubric. In the rubric, you just highlight which ones they met and where it falls. And there's a great tool called Quick Rubric, and we have that in the resource document for you. That is free, and it helps you to generate your own rubrics. And so I really like that tool. Do you do peer review with your students in the classroom? Peer review can be done online, and some people don't think this is possible, but it is. There's a wonderful tool called Eli Review. I'd love to see in the comments if anyone has ever used. Just type yes if you've used Eli Review before. But it's a fabulous tool. Anyone coming up, Amanda, that's used?
One
Yeah, we have one, two.
Good.
Two people. Yeah.
Well, then I'm glad I'm bringing a new resource to your attention. So Eli Review is, and I'm going to show you some examples of all of these in just a moment. So here's some example of the types
Lauri,
of
is it free? Is Eli Review free? That's a question that just popped up.
It is free for the next 90 days for sure. Eli Review, because of the situation that people are in, it is free right now of migrating
Okay,
online.
so it's typically not free though. Okay, good to know.
there's a pay feature
Okay,
with that. But for
thanks.
right now, it is free. So take advantage while you can
Yeah.
and enjoy that feature. So here are some examples of different types of commenting. You can see that I have something here in blue that I've highlighted. That is my instruction in the middle of someone's text. So I just used some lorem ipsum dummy text here, but I said these two sentences don't seem to flow. How would it affect your paragraph if you added a transition explaining how? And I said this one phrase relates to the other phrase, so you can go right in line. I use track changes. If you can see where it says author, comma, year in red, that's using the track changes function. So I didn't give away the store here. I didn't say exactly how to do it, but I modeled, hey, you need a citation here. The citation should be the author's last name and then the year. They still have to do a little on their own to fill out that information. I didn't just edit it using track changes. So that's what I mean by using track changes judiciously. Show them where something could go, but not just doing all the work for them. And you can see the margin comments I have over here, where you can give reactions to the students' writing. Reactions not only to how they wrote, but the ideas in their writing. Don't forget to do that because they're communicating with you. Communicate back about the ideas that they're sharing. I try to make sure I include some positive things. This is just me. I always put smiley faces next to my positive comments so the student can see those and notice them, that everything is just an opportunity for improvement. But you also do offer those opportunities for improvement. And some of the comments that I have here, and Joanna Beth is going to talk about this a little bit more, I don't actually type in word for word as I'm going through. I have some phrase expanders that you'll learn a little bit more about later on to make it easier to type those margin comments and inline comments or those summative comments at the end. And finally, you can see a summative comment that I've added here where you present some positives. I complimented the person on having very clean grammar, no spelling errors, and I talked about what they could do to strengthen their paragraph. So give the positives and give those areas for improvement as summative comments. So just some different ways you can use ways to communicate with your student on the paper in an on-screen environment. This is what Eli Review looks like for peer editing. And it is a software package that allows you to create prompts for students to give guided peer review. Sometimes you feel a little reticent to use peer review with your students when you're not right there to hear what they're saying. You want to make sure people are being kind and doing it in the proper way, that they're not taking ownership of someone's work. But with guided peer review, you can really ensure that. You can give a Likert scale of different types of responses from 1 to 5 on certain traits of writing, or even stars, 1 to 5 stars on different traits of writing. Or you can use trait identification where you have the traits and they mark if they see that trait in the student's writing. So it's very guided student feedback that you can use. And again, we're providing a link to this tool as well. And the last one I wanted to show you was that quick rubric, just what that looks like. I just generated a simple and easy rubric, and you say which qualities a paper demonstrates, whether it's on a high level, on a mid level, or on a low level, and then you highlight which ones the student met, and you can, as a way of giving feedback as well. And it doesn't have to be the final feedback for the paper. This is great in the drafting process. If you want to give some, while they're still working on it, hey, for what you have so far, this is what I'm seeing, and they know where they need to improve to move on. So rubrics are fantastic for that. So quick rubric is that tool. So I'm going to pass along to Joanna Beth to talk some more about feedback options, and she can tell you more later on about that phrase express.
Thanks very much, Lauri. I just ironically had a cough, but it's something in my throat. I think you can hear. So anyway, I wanted to bring up some things that were happening in the chat as well.
Oh, please
we're
do.
talking about feedback options here. And we've mentioned that many things you want to do on a printed assignment, you can also do on a screen. And you are the one who's going to decide how you want to present that information. So we've looked at different options, but what Suzanne brought into the conversation was, this caught people by surprise. Many of her students are only going to have access to their phone for connection. They're not necessarily going to have full access to Word and things like that. And so, we have to be cognizant of the ways that our students are going to be able to communicate with us. Daniel had mentioned some software that is chat software, but you can also screen share in it called Discord. So, that's something. And I know, Abigail, you mentioned you were a high school teacher. And so probably you see your students using chat apps all the time. They probably prefer to communicate with you that way. Some other people mentioned, using Blackboard and things like that. But keeping in mind that our students, some of them, they're going to have data limits on their phone. They don't have an endless cache allowance for all that data on their phone. So you may need to stick to text-based feedback options, and you can. That's perfectly fine. Lauri talked about the very basic ways of, just the telephone. And if you don't want to give out your home number, getting a Google number and doing it, doing those sorts of things too. And with respect to screencasting, it is an effective asynchronous form of feedback in that it adds that context to written comments, but you don't have to do it. You can simply give, the text-based comments. If you do decide to screencast, you can offer next step or emphasize those next steps to students. One thing to keep in mind is that students can rewatch a screencast, which is really nice. We find a lot of multilingual writers really appreciate that. But if you don't already know about them, with respect to text-based feedback, we want to make sure you have information about text expanders. So these are fabulous. They do a lot of the work for you regarding feedback that you give frequently. Phrase Express is the name of one of those text expanders. There are several out there, and I've tried several. I haven't tried them all, but I've tried several of them, and among them, I found Phrase Express to be the best for my purposes. So on the next slide, I've demonstrated how Phrase Express works using screencasting, of course, but you can easily download Phrase Express and use it, but here's just a little demonstration of how you can make it work for you, and it's a great time saver.
So Phrase Express is a dandy little tool that can help you save lots of time typing. It's a text expander tool, and what it uses is little snippets of auto text that tell Phrase Express what particular predetermined content you want to paste into a document or an application or a program. It works across platforms. And once you type in that auto text, it populates the long form version for you. So if you recall on the screencast recording that you saw, I had some next steps listed for the student. I did not type in all of that information. I simply typed in the auto text that triggered that information. And I'll demonstrate that now. So I typed in the auto text that I came up with to assign to Phrase Express to tell it to populate my next steps for academic authenticity. So that's my little code that I came up with. When I tell it that and I press the delimiter, which for me is the space key, it then populates that information. I did the same thing with the proofreading strategy infographic that I pasted. So I simply type proof and I for infographic, and that is the auto text that I have assigned to this rule. I press the space key, and there goes the infographic. So you can see how simple that makes it and how much time it saves when you're offering feedback that you offer frequently. Then you can certainly go back and personalize any of this in any way that it needs to be. And we certainly encourage you to do that. Phrase Express is one of many text expander programs, but I have found it to be the most useful and the most user-friendly and one of the most robust for the purposes I use it for.
There was a question about, will this work in Google Docs? Yes, this works across platforms. I haven't found one that it doesn't work with yet, which is why I really love it.
I agree, JB. I use it in everything. Everything. Email, I mean, I have not found one where it does not work. It's amazing. It is so cool.
And many text expanders you can use in on a PC, but they won't allow you to export them in that comma format where you can upload it onto a Mac computer if you work in a Mac environment too, which I do. I work in both, and this Phrase Express goes across both of those. So it's really I love it, absolutely love it. And this is where you can find it on the resources. And I'll let Lauri talk about these different categories.
So when you get access to this document, the resource document, we tried to make it as easy to access as possible. And again, as Joanna Beth said, we purposefully were not exhaustive in the resources that we provided. We put ones on here that we either were familiar with because people have talked to us about them, or we have used them ourselves, and we know that they work very well. So they're color coded to try and make it easier. Anything in yellow is something that is designed more for an individual user, works best for just one person. Anything in blue works best for teams. And then anything in green, as you can guess, is both. It can work for individuals and teams. So this should be pretty easy to follow what the colors mean. And we have the links on here, as well as we have told you some basic information about what it will cost or what any kind of limitations would be with using that software. So hopefully this will be a handy resource for you. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that are on there, specifically about scheduling, because I think that's a big deal. If you're meeting in a group and you can announce to the group, hey, we're all meeting at this time, it's not as difficult. But if you're meeting one-on-one with students, finding some way to get your schedule to each other can be a problem sometimes. So you don't want to email back and forth and say, when are you available? Well, I'm available at 5. Are you available at 3? So you end up with 5 or 6 emails going back and forth to get the scheduling. Not at all efficient. So you need to use some scheduling software, and there's some fantastic free scheduling software that is out there. Calendly is one that I have used before, and you enter your own availability, the hours that you want to be scheduled for, into Calendly, and you can share that calendar then, and the student can choose to sign up for a day at a time, and you can even program it to send an automated email that's triggered once they have signed up for that slot, that tells them, okay, here's your link that you're going to go to, here's the day and time, and sends reminders. So it's a great tool. 10 to 8 works the same way. I put 10 to 8 on there because that one is free for up to 2 users, whereas Calendly is only free for 1. So I wanted to include both of those, but they're both great resources. If you're working with a team, I would really lean towards using one of the team options if at all possible. A lot of you probably have used WC Online. In fact, I would love to have you put yes in the chat if you've used, or you can use the yes reaction button if you've used WC Online.
We're getting some yeses coming in, quite a few.
So I'm preaching to the choir about WC.
It sounds like it, yes.
You all know the tool that it works. So it not only works for scheduling, it works for data tracking, and there's also screen sharing that's available through WC Online, so you don't have to find an outside resource to do that. So it's really fantastic. It can trigger those emails for reminders. It can trigger sending a survey to follow up after an appointment. So it does a lot of administrative things that are really useful. The catch is the cost. So if you have not had an online team before and you've just been able to sign up, using a paper calendar, and you have to start using an online calendaring system, you're going to need to have something like WC Online. But WC Online is right now $800 for the whole year. And it's for the whole team, regardless of how big your team is, which is actually kind of a bargain when you look at some of the online calendaring options. So we do recommend that one. You might even ask for emergency funding from your college. Don't be afraid to ask for those things. We're in a really crisis kind of time, and you might be surprised where you think, well, it's not on my budget, I can't afford that. Well, you don't know until you ask. So put in the ask for that if you can. There is a new one that's because WC Online has done so well. I think they had someone that came out and mimicked what they did. So there now is Time Slot, and Time Slot is very similar to WC Online. And because they're competing, they are undercutting the price a little bit. So they are $700 a year, but for the first year, they are giving a 50% discount. So for $350, you can get your whole team online, and it has the built-in video conferencing. So again, that's something that you can probably sell and say, hey, this is not that expensive when you think about it and how many people we can serve through using this resource. So those are some tools for individuals, Calendly, and 10 to 8 for teams. I would lean toward the WC Online and the Time Slot. But if you have to go low tech with your team, don't be afraid to use individual calendars. Like, everyone has their own Calendly, and then they will have to be responsible for populating those appointments, perhaps in a Google Calendar. Copy them over onto a Google Calendar so everyone knows what everyone else is doing. Speaking of which, that kind of communication is important, especially if you're scheduling webinars, perhaps even across faculty, because you might be duplicating efforts. If you have one calendar where everyone puts where their webinars are, you might be able to say that one teacher is doing a webinar on such and such a topic that would apply to to your students, and so you can have your students attend that webinar. So if you're working with other teachers or with a team, having team communication, a team calendar of who is presenting when is going to be really important. So look at Google Calendars for that kind of team calendaring function. So
Thank
JB,
you.
why don't you talk about some types of appointments? Since we talked about calendars, what kind of appointments would you schedule on those calendars?
Yeah, there are basically 3 types that we have on this slide. We also need to think about office hours, and I'm going to kind of fly through this because I'd like for us to at least have a couple of minutes at the end for questions. When you talk about types of appointments, we've got one-to-one appointments with students. There are also one-to-many appointments with students, and then the office hour drop-in appointments. So, do think about holding office hours. I mention this because for some at the university level, this notion is, old hat. It's conventional stuff, but you're just going to move them online with some decisions about how you want to go about that, asynchronously or synchronously, or a combination of those things. But for K-12 teachers, like office hours it's like a mind-blowing luxury. And well, guess what? Now, K-12 teachers, you have office hours. So think about this, and this is a question for everyone. How do you want to hold those? Do you want to set a lump time where students can drop in to a video conference perhaps, or call you at that time, or instant message you? You'll be available all those sorts of ways, or will you just be available in one way? And are you going to have groups meeting with you? Will you allow students to come in groups, or do you just want one-on-one? Do you want to leave a message board? Are you going to have asynchronous office hours? Email is an asynchronous office hour. You can set up a discussion board through any, there are a lot of apps for this. My kindergartner's teacher has this awesome little app, and it's called Seesaw, and she uploads all kinds of things there. And right now she's teaching his kindergarten class using that app. It's really cool. So just think about how you want to set these up, having a combination of synchronous and asynchronous office hours, or one or the other. You might want to try several options, see which one works best, which ones students seem to gravitate to, or which ones they need at this point, which is, that point Suzanne brought up, which is an excellent one. And just see which one sticks. It's up to you. There are lots of fun questions to think about right now. And speaking of questions, we have Q&A on the next slide, and then we do have a link to the survey as well. And I am going to drop the link to the survey in the chat. And the survey, once you take this survey, then that's where you'll find the link to the resources. It's at the end of the survey. And thank you for taking the survey and offering your feedback on today's session. We really, truly appreciate your participation here today, and just your presence here today and what you've shared. Amanda, are there any questions from the chat we should?
No, there's just been a couple people saying thank you, and then we just got one that was interesting. Daniel said for one of classes, we're just using Google Meet during our normal class times, and the professor lectures as normal and poses questions. So I think, there's so many creative ways to do this, and I'm glad that you guys have shared some of your own. It's been awesome to hear from you as well, because I think between all of us, we have some great ideas now. Yeah, so I don't think there were any other questions so far.
I learned a lot from our audience today
as
well.
Right?
Chat, yes. Well, it's wonderful. It was wonderful to be here with all of you and to learn from you. I love these collegial groups. So if there is anything else that would be helpful to you at this time, please let us know. Let us know in that survey, because if we can be of assistance, we would like to be. The 3 of us help each other out all the time. And, we do this with our colleagues, and we want to fill in any way that we can, especially right now for our students.
And thank you, a special thank you to Sherry for helping us to do this, to put this together, because we wouldn't have the reach of the audience without your help in organizing this and sponsoring it. So thank you so much.
Oh gosh, the pleasure is all mine. As I was sitting here today, I just wrote, I didn't expect to learn so many terrific ideas about how to provide feedback. My biggest problem about providing feedback online sometimes is that it takes me longer to do that than to do it when I just do it the old school way. And yet I know my students get a lot more out of it. For one, they can read it, right? And I was just delighted to be reminded that there is a way to use a shorthand that'll allow all the text to be there. So this was so worth it. The time getting it set up was so worth it to get this toolbox. And I just thank all of you for 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 sharing these resources and everyone else who logged in today. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's great to have connection during this time where we're kind of isolated in our homes.
So true. Some community
Yeah.
for all of us.
Yes, and someone mentioned in the chat that just the care and concern, which I think we all feel certainly for one another and for our students. And so, you know, that sense of community is so important. And I definitely felt that with everyone here today. Thank you for that.
Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to providing those resources to you, and let us know how we can help.